Hello everyone and welcome to a live edition of the Royal Blue podcast. I'm your host Chris Beesley, joined by my colleague Everton correspondent for the Echo, Joe Thomas, and our regular guest Gavin Buckland. Just before we start, I want to preview tomorrow's trip to Brighton Hove Albion. Just remind you that it's I did a very special edition of the Royal Blue podcast earlier this week when I went down to speak to the renowned sports artist Paul Trevelyan, gave his amazing thoughts. Some 87 years on, I must add, on Everton legend Dixie Dean, and the anniversary of that game was yesterday. I mean, the podcast, thankfully, been very well received, and I'd implore you all to give that one a listen. There's not too much of me on it. I'm there with him, and it's mainly Paul Trevelyan. But incredible memories of Dixie, and it's got the seal of approval, no doubt, from Dixie's own daughter and granddaughter who've taken it in, and Melanie Prentice's granddaughter. She absolutely loves it. So I think for football fans of any persuasion, really, to give that one a go if possible. But as we get back to contemporary matters, Joe, you were at Finch Farm yesterday to speak to Sean Dyche previewing this fixture, and some interesting comments from the manager. He spoke about for the first time, he admitted that the points deduction could be playing on the minds of the players.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably an important part, bearing in mind we're live, and I mean we're just at lunchtime now on Friday. Probably worth starting by saying that at the moment there's been no there's been no verdict on the points appeal just yet. So at the moment, I mean, the fact that we're sat down here suggests that we're not scrambling around to write anything at this stage. So we're getting towards the end of another week without an answer. Obviously, there is still potential for that to change over the next few hours, but I mean, where we end up, I'm not entirely sure. Myself and Chris heading down to Brighton later, and I think both of us have this horrible vision of filing on the road, on driving down the M6, writing pieces about whatever the outcome is. But hopefully that won't be the case. But having said that, no, you're perfectly right there, Chris. Spoke to Sean Dyche, actually asked him about this. This was in the embargo section, so this is after the cameras go off from what people see on live, and was asking about. Well, actually, my starting point, the question was saying, from your perspective, Sean, obviously I'm speaking on a Thursday afternoon, would you have any concerns about the answer to this coming out on the Friday, given the the impact it could have on your preparations going to Saturday? Is Friday a bad time for this? Because it's clearly something that's been weighing on the players' minds, and whilst Dyche acknowledges that for the first time in this interview, I think, let's be perfectly honest, common sense would tell us that that's always been the case. Dyche's answer was no, football is ready for the outcome, including them. I think his verdict is that clarity is needed as soon as possible, because once everybody has clarity, they have an idea as to what the state of play is and how what conditions Everton are operating in. An outcome in this still doesn't lead to an end of uncertainty, because we have the second case, of course, coming. But at least gives us a little bit more of guidance as to where Everton are as we stand here right now and approach to kind of the final third of the season, as it were. But yeah, you're right there. Dyche acknowledged for the first time, really, that there's probably a psychological impact that the off-pitch uncertainty is having on his players. He says that their focus has been very good, but he can only control so much. He can control what goes on the training ground. He can control what goes on about kind of the health and care of the players around, in their wider lives, as far as the club can have a say in that. But what he can't do is he can't control what they're thinking as they drive to and from the training ground, or when they wake up in the morning ahead of a game and things like that. And I think that is just logical, to be perfectly honest. And it feels significant because he's saying this for the first time. The reaction's been quite interesting, because obviously I've put it out there this morning, and I've been surprised by how many people are saying that it's interesting he says this after what was, I think, we would all accept a really poor result and performance in a big game. Probably the first time in a few months that you can actually genuinely question a Dyche side and its performance and its setup. So there might be a few cynics amongst us. Maybe that is slightly. Maybe that's an indictment of when Dyche opens up when it comes to being asked questions by the press, because he's been asked this for a long time. And I think it's very clear that he I think Dyche is an intelligent person, and I think he approaches press conferences with an idea of what he's happy to say and what he's not happy to say. And I think as a result of that, he has a degree of control over when he releases certain bits. The reality is, it's probably had a psychological impact on the players from the very beginning. And, you know, if there'd been acknowledgement of that more throughout the process, then perhaps there'd be less skepticism around releasing that information now. But ultimately, I do think that it's something that's weighing on his mind, the players' mind. It's weighing on all of our mind. I think we can all, if we step back from any gameplay and actually understand, have sympathy and empathy with Dyche and the players, because we've probably all been in unfortunate positions where there's been uncertainty around what we're doing in our day jobs and in our lines of work, whatever they have been, and that isn't easy for anybody that's operating in those circumstances.
Yeah, and we obviously welcome all your comments on this, on any other topics that we're going to discuss today, Gav. But following on from what Joe says, Gav, what do you think about the timing of this? It is interesting, like as Joe says, it must be natural that it has been playing on their minds all this time, but to come out and make that admission now at this moment in time.
Well, yeah, it'd be interesting to see why that's the case, but how the impact's affecting them. Is it just the fact that actually we've lost 10 points and we've not got what we deserve this season? Or is it because the 10 points is now forced us into the relegation zone, and so we are now thinking with the psychology of a club in and around the relegation zone, like we were last season and the season before? They're two completely different things, aren't they? Because if we were 5 points ahead of the relegation zone, it's a different feeling, isn't it? Okay, but it's a 10 points. So we're disappointed. We should be 8th rather than 15th or something like that. That's a slightly different feeling, isn't it? A very different feeling too. Actually, what this has done now is, rather than being 12th, we're now in the relegation zone, and we are now playing with the pressure of a relegation threatened side. And I suspect it's the latter. To be honest with you, I think it's the position the 10-point deduction has put us in, rather than the 10-point deduction per se. And you saw that I think you saw that on Monday all day long, didn't you?
Yeah.
That looked like a team that was, and because we were playing Palace as well, that was under pressure. And I think that is and you can fully understand that. I don't think it's the 10-point deduction as such; it's the impact of the 10-point deduction. And I think so. That's one angle, and I think that's definitely the case. You can see that in plain sight. I think the other angle to this is the effect on Dyche. Does uncertainty and stuff like that. I'm fairly certain that if he had an extra 5 points, he'd be looking at his team selection slightly different on occasions, tactics in games. I think that is one thing at the end of the season. I think you can probably look back and say, in reviewing the campaign, wherever we finish, in January and February, if I knew we were 5 points better off, I might have done something slightly different. And I think that probably is also the other aspect of it. So I think there's two things: impact on players, impact on Dyche. But I definitely think the impact on players is there in plain sight. We are now in the relegation zone or in and around it, and we wouldn't be in that position if we had the extra 10 points. And I can fully understand that. If you were further up the table, I think the 10-point deduction impact is slightly different vibe to it, and I fully agree with it, and that's fully understandable.
Yeah, just to come back there, I think in the rounds and the wider conversation, one of the things that Dyche was pointing to is the fact that the 10 points is applied immediately. So I think he seems to suggest that it might have less of an impact if it was, whilst the appeal was pending, the 10 points remained on Everton's points tally, as opposed to now, because it changes that mindset, doesn't it? It's the difference of going into Palace 12th, 5 or 6 points clear of Palace, and thinking, all right, we want to try and increase a buffer to the relegation zone, but psychologically we haven't got that pressure of seeing Everton in and around that dotted line throughout this process. So I think you're spot on there where you say it's probably it's almost the process of the deduction, and what it means, rather than the fact that there's off the pitch uncertainty.
I think that's
so. I think that's significant. I think you make a really valid point around selection and how that might have changed depending on how this process had been handled over recent months. I think there's probably less of an opportunity for reflection on that for Dyche, simply because if you look at for the last 2 months, we already know that he's got a very small squad, and the injuries have probably meant that there hasn't actually been that much he could have done differently for most of those games. But the first game that we can probably say, actually, there's a degree of accountability and responsibility from the dugout for how things have unfolded on the pitch, and it could have been different and probably should have been different, is that Palace game. Because you know, there were other options in that starting lineup and other ways of approaching that game. And unfortunately, you know, it didn't play out, and that feels quite detrimental. I think we're probably at a point now where there was a hope that things would start righting themselves, so Everton could help get themselves out of this a little bit more. But instead, the form of Luton, which is, you know, obviously they've had defeats recently, but they've probably picked up more points than we all expected them to. That's exacerbated the situation, along with the fact that Everton have just gone so long without winning the Premier League has also made things worse. So all of a sudden, you know, I think they've probably gone from hoping for points back to starting to think, actually, we need points back here.
Yeah,
because they're not getting them on the pitch.
And that's the thing, it's the same scenario that's played out 2022 and 23, isn't it? You just get that impression when you know, listen to conversations with Dyche and players and, you know, the general atmosphere around the club. It's the same as 22 and 23, albeit for completely different reasons. Yeah. And when you're in that position, you know, you're just under pressure. Yeah. Fans feel it, don't they?
And also, I guess, the longer that you're in a relegation zone or in and around the relegation zone, it's probably natural, the more that you start to begin to feel like you are a relegation threatened team rather than a team that's got 8 wins and you know, and 30 points, isn't it? Yeah. That must have an impact, because it would take some resolve to be 2 months on going into this saying, oh, actually, no, we are mid-table side. That's 2 months on without a win. And the one, another thing, like what I would say in relation to Dyche is, I thought he was being genuine and open. And again, timing is awkward, and I think that's perhaps a situation created for himself, because I think sometimes he, you know, probably comes out of maybe trying to protect the players, protect the dressing room, and obviously there are battles there that we don't see because we're not inside the club. We're not privy to them in his mindset, and there'll be reasons for what he does. But obviously, if he'd been a bit more open on this a couple of weeks ago, then it, you know, amid the injuries or when things weren't looking as severe, or there hadn't just been a game like the Palace one, then there might be a degree more of acceptance of what he's saying. But I do think what he's saying is legitimate, justified. You know, maybe could have said it earlier, but I think he does make strong points. And I also think it's worth bearing in mind that whilst, you know, obviously he says this after the Palace game, which was a bad night for Everton, he was also adopting the same strategy when things were good. You know, he wasn't going, when we had those 4 wins in a row, he wasn't going, this has galvanised the club, this has galvanised the players. Again, he took the same approach, so he has been consistent, just like he hasn't sought to, you know, give influence to the deduction on those wins and that run of form. You know, now there's a consistent approach there, so I don't think it's necessarily excuse making. I can understand why it's read that way.
Yeah, it's true. You said obviously, Gav, about the table, because obviously the initial, obviously there was a defeat to United, but then it was the 4 wins in a row, and as Joe just said, 2 months now without the Premier League victory. Just looking at his actual quotes here, he says, Dyche, I think the focus has been good. But the bit I'm talking about is the subliminal bit. When you're driving your car and you're wondering, I can't control that. I can control the training programme, health and well-being around that, what we do, but I can't control their inner thoughts. Again, it's going back to that phrase he uses, controlling the controllables. But like you said, it is an inevitability, and the people, like you said, you will change your actions because of this and your thoughts.
Well, I think that the thoughts are because you're in the relegation battle, and you know, we're looking at, which we weren't doing properly before Christmas, looking at the results of other clubs, now, and their fixtures. And
well, I mean, how many of us were sitting there at half-time at Anfield the other night thinking,
yeah, absolutely. And I think like that is the thing, isn't it? We're just in that same position, and I get what he's saying, but he couldn't do that last year to a degree, could you? In 2023, when you find you don't know what players feel like away from the pitch. And it's pretty much in the same boat, and I think he can only do what he can do. So I think that's I'm guessing here completely, but I think the pressure on players is because they're in the relegation start, not you know, I've got a real sense of, you know, anger because we've lost 10 points.
Burning injustice.
Yeah, I think
there was that at the beginning.
I think that but you accept that, don't you? Really, after a while, and you adapt. I think the thing is it's the relegation thing.
Because you can see the same thing with the fans, can't
you?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, obviously the fans were up for Monday night, but it was almost it was hard to see, you know, chicken and egg situation where you could see that there was a degree of concern, and all of a sudden it's moving from anger at the footballing authorities to more kind of fear and trepidation, anxiety over what might be coming Everton's way if they can't sort things on the pitch, and maybe that nervousness was obviously exacerbated by the players who very quickly adopted a patterns of play which I think frustrated everybody and added to the sense. And maybe it's, whether it started in the stands and moved on to the pitch, or whether it started in the pitch and moved on to the stands, is an interesting argument. But I think that players, fans, manager, the club, I think we're all actually in the same position here. And
I think that's a very good point Joe makes, because you detected that on Monday, didn't you? Whereas probably the home games for the previous, how many home games you've had since the original commission, maybe 4, 5, 6, can't remember. The anger is very much on the terraces as being to the Premier League, hasn't it? And you've had all the all the cards out and stuff. The anger on Monday was more directed towards the player and manager, a lot more, I thought, at the end of the game, and quite rightly so, and understandably so, because it was a poor performance. And in some respects, that's quite comforting to hear, because it means that we know where we stand. There's knowledge of where we stand. At the same time, it just shows that we the reality is that you can direct your anger to the Premier League, and quite rightly, and the commission, but ultimately you've got to fight the battle on the pitch, haven't you, really? And that is, and acknowledge where you are, and where we are is we're in a relegation battle, like it or lump it. That may change, and it may change again, and may change again and again, but that's where we are. And I think that was a bit of a wake up call on Monday,
and I think
as a consequence.
it is exhausting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when I think about this week, if you think for obviously us working around it and supporters and for the players, just this week alone, and we're miles away from the end of the season at the moment. But you go Monday night, Everton go 1-0 down to Palace, thinking, I could get cut adrift here. Obviously, come back and get a draw. Tuesday night, half time, it's 0-0, Man City, Brentford. You're thinking, Brentford going to pick up a point and just move a little bit further here. Wednesday night, you got Luton winning at Anfield at half time. And all right, Everton got a point. Luton and Brentford both lost. But every night you're being hit with that in and around, aren't you? That stress. And football isn't life or death. It's not the most important thing in the world, but it is something that has a massive impact on all of our lives. And just over the course of those 3 days in the middle of a week, there you're going. Like every single
just
time.
to lighten this up for a second, what I was going to say, I can't believe this, because I just checked the full-time scores. I am not one of these people. I didn't know that Luton were 1-0 up at Anfield until that point, and I saw the final score. It was 4-1 Liverpool. I was like, okay, we're all cop-outs that night. What a line to say on the Royal Blue podcast. But especially these tough seasons that Everton are going through at the moment, and we were talking about the games right at the end of last season. Was it Newcastle, Leicester 50 up there, and then Hearts in the mouth stuff? I just checked the final score at the end of the game, and good or bad, it is what it is. I don't live it. It's enough having to live the Everton games without having to see, Luton are 1-0 up at Anfield.
Yeah. Far more disciplined than I am. Far more disciplined.
Just to extend a little bit further, I play football from 8 till 9 of a Wednesday, and you can hear, if Liverpool are playing at home, you can hear the roars of the crowd.
Oh, right.
I normally on here they go, they scored, haven't they? And I've never been so comforted in my life playing football.
Step, was it?
They're like, they scored. That's good news, And then he scored again, I think, shortly after. And then we had the third one, thinking that is good news. And but that's what happens, isn't it? We've had this the last 2 seasons, but I do think that this is where it's impacting on the players and the club and the managers, isn't it? Where the 10 points have put us, not the 10-point deduction.
Yeah, well, on a similar theme, Joe, another article you've done obviously there about the Everton Fans Advisory Board and the Leicester that they've done now. They've called for an end to the lingering uncertainty which they believe is casting a long shadow over the club. I mean, this isn't just talking about the points deduction. This is about the ongoing proposed takeover of the club, 777. I mean, it's something you've been over now for a long time. I mean, when the statement was originally made in September, wasn't it? Farhad Moshiri agreed the sale of his entire stake of the club. They were expecting a decision by the end of the calendar year. Here we are now, but we're almost into March and it's still not been resolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, we now know that this was the case, but we probably all had a few suspicions that they were bullish projections for a result before Christmas. Yeah. They gave us a time frame that we compare things for, but I mean, even at the time, people were saying it would probably go into the new year, perhaps not to the extent that we thought it would do. Yeah. Everton are just in this very unhappy position at the moment, are they? Where there's just so much uncertainty, and then there's this strange kind of irony to the fact that it's both the ball in both cases is essentially with the Premier League. I know it's an independent commission that we're waiting on to deliver its verdict in relation to the appeal, but still the culmination of a Premier League process. And yeah, I mean, it was strong words from the FAB, and I think it's probably important to say it came after its regular meeting with the club, a meeting at which different people have different opinions on the fan advisory board. I think that a lot of very good people dedicate a lot of time and effort to doing what they can to fight for fans in relation and to raise fan perspectives with the club, and I think that's valuable. And in this case, you can see they've been asking questions about the club's finances in relation to things like the deduction and then the appeal, but also in relation to 777 takeover or attempted takeover. Now, they might not have got the answers that they're after, but I mean that's something that all of us are struggling to currently get at the minute. But I think the fact that they're willing to kind of go out there and just break their silence, I think is will it make a difference? I don't think so. I don't think the Premier League are going to spring into action because Everton fan advisory board said this. But I think that what is fair to say, and I think they're doing a very good job at highlighting this, is Everton are in an unhappy position at the moment where they seem to essentially be the test case for two different Premier League processes. And unfortunately, in both, they've probably highlighted that neither process is fit for purpose or completely fit for purpose. Now that we want the Premier League's fitting, the owner and directors test, we want that to be as rigorous as it needs to be. We want, of course, we want that. I think that we've said it from the start, and I think we still do. We all have, or I certainly do have reservations about 777 and whether or not they're viable and suitable owners for Everton Football Club. So we want the scrutiny to be serious and for it to be applied properly. But there also has to be an end to the process. And my understanding is that last week the Premier League asked more questions to 777 in relation to funding and funding strategies for the next 3 years. I mean, we're into the 6th month of the process now. I mean, surely that they were the first questions to be dealt with. And if there's still concerns now 6 months on, or 5 and a bit months on, over the sources of that, then, and over those basic questions, then that raises its own issues. At some point, the purgatory's got to end and a decision's got to be made. And you wonder if there's an element almost of the police. I don't know where that came from. The Premier League, almost being too afraid to make a decision because they're almost not sure which way to go on this. Because that, for all the concerns about 777, they've put more than £150 million of junior debt into the club. Like, there isn't a way of looking at that and not thinking that they are playing a significant role in paying the bills that are keeping everything going. Because why else would you take on that debt? So, it's a really, I don't know what the answer on that is. I think, I have serious concerns over 777, but I also have serious concerns over what's to happen if they didn't get approval. But essentially, we are into a 6 month now. This lingering uncertainty is something that has is casting a pall over the club and over the fan base at the moment, and it is something that for the future of the club, short term, long term, it needs some certainty over. We either need to get to a point now, and surely we must be close, where the Premier League go to 777. Either your answers aren't good enough, or they make a decision based on the information that they've got, and where that leads us, I'm not entirely sure. But just like with the Premier, just like with the points deduction again, it's an appeal Everton are the guinea pig in, and whilst we can talk long about how Everton have put themselves in a position where they've exposed themselves to this uncertainty, and they've exposed themselves to being test cases in these official regulatory protocols, and the club has to take some responsibility for that. We're all kind of experiencing, I think, fatigue in relation to this, and I don't think it is in anybody's interests now for either of these processes to be dragging on.
I mean, Gav, you've said in many ways is actually more important than the points reduction, but Everton seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place,
including the Premier League. Far more important than the commission. This issue, as Joe was saying, I think the key thing here is there's two things going on, isn't it? At the same time, I can't help feeling that if there was no commission going on at the same time, that Everton's finances was okay, whether they'd be getting taken over is a different thing. If there's one decision the Premier League had to deal with, one thing, it would have been made earlier. I think the fact there's a commission going on and all about publicity that the Premier League has, engendered, for quite legitimately, means that they are in between a rock and a hard place on this. I mean, they can't reject; they can only approve, can't they? But
it's a bit of a grey area.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm trying to work out at the moment and get some clarity on is whether actually the Premier League can ever actually just say no, or whether it's incumbent on the potential new owners to prove that they're suitable.
Yeah.
And that's when and either prove it or walk away because they realise that they can't. I'm not quite sure on that at the minute.
So in the Premier League's rock and hard place position is they've got this test that they've got 777 going to pass, and they might think, not so sure about that. But actually, if we don't allow it, we're going to get a whole load of stick over the length of time it's taken, and the fact this is another way of if Everton really struggle financially as a consequence of that we've been again part of that. So that the alternative to that is we allow 777, but actually we don't really think they pass the owners test, and so they are in a rock and hard place. And some of that I think is because of this commission going on simultaneously. If that wasn't going on, then I think they probably would have made the decision earlier. I suspect one of the reasons for the delays as well is not that the Premier League's position's changed or Everton's has. The 777's position has changed. They may be, and we've all read the stories, you don't need to go there, that they may be a slightly different company in terms of their financial wherewithal last September than where they are now, where they are in at the beginning of the year. So that might have delayed things. But but I do think you can, when you throw all that into the mix, you can see why it's taken so long. And the Premier League are in an awkward spot. Some would say that's good. More has. I don't think that's good at all, because that doesn't assist Everton whatsoever. And I think that's contributed towards it. I suspect the Premier League are trying to give as much opportunity for this to go through.
Yeah,
that's what your suspicion is. I don't think the delay is. At the end of the day, we want it, but just whatever happens, we're not going to allow it, or not prove it. I think they want to try and make sure that that there's that the ownership thing goes through. But you suspect that 777 are making it difficult because of not deliberately difficult, but because of the state of their finances and stuff like this. That is just prolonging the agony for everybody, and eventually everybody suffers there, don't they?
Yeah, just finally, Jones, to say on this point, there's I think a line in one of your pieces there that the Echo understands that 777's belief is that they have provided the answers, and the decision is ultimately in Premier League hands.
Yeah, I mean that's where 777 stand. Their belief is that they've provided everything that they're going to provide, that they think they've answered everything adequately, and they're basically waiting for the rubber stamp for the Premier League. They're saying that the ball is in the Premier League's court, essentially. I think, we've spoken long and hard about this over the past 6 months or past 5 months and a bit, that where the grey area comes in is if the Premier League, there's a very realistic possibility of the Premier League thinking that we'd rather not allow 777 in, but having to weigh up a decision based on what the alternatives are. And is it a straight test? Are 777 owners that could pass the test and the scrutiny? Is that the question, and it's a straightforward yes or no, or is it, are they better than what is currently in place at the moment? And that's another question. And if they start to go down that route, things become a little bit more complicated, because it's one thing saying no to 777. If they say no to them, what then happens to the club is another question. And I don't know if the Premier League even have that in their remit to think about it. I'd argue to some extent it's not their responsibility, but as a regulatory body that has a stake in the Premier League being as strong as possible, obviously the Premier League isn't going to want to see, at a time when it's trying to fight off independent regulation as well, it's not going to want to see a club go into potentially administration or something like that if they're responsible for the support ending that might be keeping some of the lights on.
As well as part of that's where the other thing comes in, the commission comes into it as well, having been part of the commission process where Everton have suffered, will suffer eventually financially from it if there's a points deduction as well. So I think the two things are interlinked and certainly contribute towards the delay in the ownership issue. Just as well, and add on to this, kudos to the club and the FAB. I think there's some cynicism, and quite understandably so, over the role of the fan advisory board and the club under the previous regime about that relationship. But reading the comments yesterday reading the minutes and the people who were there present from Everton, I think it showed the commitment from both parties, and that was for the common good.
Colin Chong was there, and also Kevin Farwell. So I mean, there is a degree of some of the most senior people at the club turning up to. Whether or not they can answer questions or should answer questions is another matter, but they're at least there to face the questions. Yeah, and that is a good thing.
And I think that's different from the previous regime, where it was noted that somebody said they were going to turn up but didn't, or whatever. And I think any owner who's going to come in subsequently should take a note of that, of what the way Colin and the current people at the top of the shop at Everton have approached that meeting, and how they've done previously in terms of dealing with and the relationship with the fan advisory board, and kudos to the fan advisory board as well, who appear to have won, quite rightly so, a lot of the fan base over in terms of their role and the jobs they've done. As you say, it's all people's spare time and resource, and well done to everybody.
Yeah. On a brighter note, Joe, well, you and I spent all of last season going to various corners of the country watching a lot of poor Everton results, but we went to Brighton and Hove Albion on, was it the 8th of May, and watched an emphatic 5-1 victory. Same again.
I still don't know where that one came from. I still can't. Football's an absolute bizarre game. I mean, it's the beauty. It's why we love it so much. But where that came from, I don't know. I think that's probably... You would argue that Dyche's most important result was the win against Bournemouth, but probably the two most impressive performances that Everton have put under Sean Dyche is probably the Arsenal one in his first game when they won 1-0, and then this going down to the Amex and turning over this Brighton side as emphatically as they did. I think that it helps Everton right now to be away from home for a game. Maybe it helps that they are going to go and play against a side that will genuinely seek to dominate possession. For well-discussed reasons, Everton, they tend to struggle when they dominate the ball. They're not going to do that against Brighton. But obviously, it's going to be a very, very tough game. A very tough game.
Yeah. I mean, Gav, you and I were talking about this beforehand, actually, for all those great players and the great recruitment that Brighton have done, so hence why they're in their prominent position this last couple of years. You think it might possibly be a good time to play them a few hours?
They've got a few injuries, haven't they? They have picked up form. They had a ropey spot before and after Christmas, didn't they, Brighton? They have picked up form, and they've been scoring goals, haven't they? They scored 5 at Sheffield United twice, and they beat Palace 4, didn't they? But I think you'd expect to see, what would you say, guess 75-25% possession. I think
That
the
much.
more... though there's a bit of positivity for me because we are better away from home, and I know what you're saying about how the Brighton game last year, where did that happen? But subsequent away performance under Dyche between the start of the season and Christmas shows actually it wasn't necessarily a fluke, that, because we had five away wins, wasn't it, or something?
And also, there had been the away form notably improved under Dyche very quickly. So the 5-1 was an extreme example, but Everton had started to score goals on the road and be more resilient on the road before that, hadn't they? So it was it was almost like it was a fast forward, wasn't it? But it followed a trajectory of improvement.
I think there was that stat before Chris was put out that was only Gordon Leeds scored more goals in his first 12 away matches as a manager than Dyche. I think Gordon had 25, Dyche had 21 in the first 12 away matches. So they did score goals. So it did seem a fluke at the time. What did Gary Neville say when he had to give the shock of the season? He said Brighton won Everton 5. But subsequent away performances, as I say, in the rest of 2023, showed that actually maybe wasn't as big a fluke as what you think. But I think tomorrow we're in a different place to what we were in May, in that the 3 most important players that day, Calvert-Lewin, Decore, McNeil, are probably all in a different place for a number of reasons. Injury, fatigue, being out of form. That said, I don't think Brighton is as strong as what they were in May. And it makes for an interesting contest, but I'm expecting to see a repeat of what happened at Goodison. But the thing with Brighton is they'll give you a chance. They even last week against Sheffield United, when it was 2-0, Sheffield United, you always felt still had a chance if they got one. And they're a great team to watch. I love De Zerbi, but they do give the opponents a chance. And in the vast majority of their games, the opposition will score, and I think that's what you'll take into tomorrow, really.
Yeah, and whilst it's been a long wait for a win, if you look at some of the more recent away performances, obviously Wolves was a very bad one. Okay, we accept that, But Man City, they held Man City for 71 minutes. That was a strong away performance until the inevitable happened. Tottenham Hotspur, very strong away performance. Probably deserved to win that, even though they lost. So even Crystal Palace away in the FA Cup again. Obviously they drew that 0-0, but I thought they were the better side in that game. And the last 15 minutes would take a chance to push on. The last 15 minutes was taken away from them with the Dominic Calvert-Lewin red card, which obviously got rescinded. So, there isn't any. And again, this is probably where I have sympathy for the idea that the deduction and the uncertainty of the appeal is affecting the players, because again, it feels Everton are in a relegation battle as it stands. But even when you look back at recent results and performances, they're not. The Palace game was a bad game and a bad result, but it still wasn't a defeat. That's still a game they probably would have lost under Frank Lampard. Still a game they probably would have lost 18 months ago. So I mean, especially after going 1-0 down. So the reality isn't as bad as how things currently seem, but it's all amalgamated into one, and it's dragging the mood and the atmosphere and the positivity down, and that's where the problem is.
At the same time, I get the dragging moods down and positivity, but the last 2 home games you scraped draws with very late equalisers, haven't you, in both games, which shows that the team's still fighting, doesn't it?
Of course,
It's not as if they're down tools, which you suspect under Mr. Lampard they did, didn't he, really? It's particularly towards the end. It's showing that, and this goes back to the point at the start of the pod, isn't it? They are not a relegation team. They're effectively a lower mid-table team, and that's what you would expect a lower mid-table team to do. And that's encouraging as well. For all the stick they got from Monday, they still scraped a point near to the death, and that was the benefit you took from that. And I think that's the sort of thing you take into tomorrow. The difference between last May and now is we're scoring goals away from home. Then weren't we at the end of last season? We're not scoring at the moment, unless it's a set piece, and that's the concern you've got in comparing the 2 fixtures for me.
I think the big thing to look at for almost more, what will be more telling than the results tomorrow, is probably the relationship between Decore and Calvert-Lewin. Decore, Dyche said yesterday, came through unscathed his return on Monday night, so hopefully he carried on building his fitness this week. It was still quite disjointed, that relationship on Monday. Calvert-Lewin needs Decore as much as Decore needs Calvert-Lewin. They were the partnership that that destroyed Brighton last time. In the first few minutes, it was Calvert-Lewin out wide who crossed for Dominic Calvert-Lewin. So they were the reason everything was so effective last time at the Amex. So can we see some progress and some development in that relationship? Bearing in mind it's a partnership that hasn't really played together for 2 months.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Let's come to the crunch predictions time. Go on, you can go first then, Gab, because you'll just finish there. What are you going to go for? Although
I think we'll score. Yeah. I think it's a case of how well defensively we counter Brighton, and whether we keep up. Which she did for most of the game, didn't we? Goodison kept our shape well. Didn't really give them a lot of opportunities during the game. And if we can do that, then I'm going to stick me neck on the block here and say 1-1. I think we'll score that. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Joe?
2-2 I'm going to go for.
1-1, 2-2.
That's it. I mean, I'm being optimistic. I think a draw would be a very, very good result for a number of reasons. Like Gav says, I do think Everton can score against this team, and probably what's most telling is the pattern in which the goals go in. But fingers crossed.
Well, I'll be even more optimistic to end this pod on a high note. Last 2 seasons, Everton only won 2 away games last season. They only won 2 the season before that. Half of those wins have come at Brighton Hove Albion. Maybe it's a lucky ground for the Blues. 2-0 under Rafa, wasn't it? And then obviously the 5-1 there. So I'm going to be ultra positive, and I'm actually going to say, where's this one going to come from? Not quite as good as last season. I'll say 3-1 Everton, and what a way to end the pod. Yeah.
Be a nice drive back tomorrow night.
Yeah. Let's hope so. We'll end it on that note. Thank you. You've had Gavin Buckland, you've had Joe Thomas, you've had myself, Chris Beesley, your host, and this has been the Royal Blue Podcast.